Am I not so bound up with a body and with senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have convinced myself there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? No. If I convince myself of something, then I certainly existed. I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. End quote. Descartes. You're listening to Socratic Smarts.
Here is the point. Here is the point. Here is the point.
Chop the volume and go down on the other side. Pick up it from. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight, and whether this is quite authentic.
Welcome back, listener, to the show. I'm Pneumatic J. It's a pleasure to be here, wherever I'm at, whether I'm in your ears, in your speakers, wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, whatever's going on. I hope it's kicking off well for you. It's 2020, you know. It's good. It's going well for me. Just to put it out there, I'm loving it. It's a good decade. I think it's gonna be a fun one. This is just the infancy of where hopefully this show is going. So let's just get right into it, guys. Let's just get right into the news. Let's take a different approach there. In today's topic, we'll be looking at Socrates in the Republic. So stay tuned for the next segment if that's what you're here for. That segment will be focused on a few excerpts actually in the Republic, where we'll look at a dialogue that Socrates has. And just to give the very briefest of backgrounds, the Republic is essentially Plato's dialogue on how he sees Athenian society, what would be the reforms he would make if he could, and he expresses this through Socrates and some other characters, Glaucon, Adimantus, Plato's older brothers, and the character of Thrasymachus, who we'll be looking at in the excerpts. But that'll be the next segment. In the first segment, I want to lay some foundation, because we've already tackled on this show some of the most, you might say, tumultuous philosophical territory, namely death. Very emotional for some people, very hard to approach in a way that is non-judgmental without some prior belief about what it means. Many of us at a young age get the impression that death is one thing or another just simply because we were told something at a very young age. And what I want to do with this show is model a different approach to thinking about these issues, where we try to remain as curious and as interested in exposing our ignorance as we possibly can, but at the same time acknowledge the fact that it is going to be emotionally tumultuous, and there will be feelings that get hurt simply because these are the most interesting topics that we want to talk about, but we'd be silly and foolish to deny that they are the most foundational and interesting questions that we find ourselves asking, and that our ancestors found ourselves asking. Where are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? What does it all mean? What will it be in the end? And so to deny ourselves the privilege of having these conversations and sort of playing our instruments while we still are able to in this life and figuring it out for ourselves if we can, we tend to maybe put that issue aside. We sort of put that in a mental suitcase and put it away and say, I've already decided there is a heaven, there is a something or whatever, and you can decide for yourself on these philosophical issues. Now, I'm sort of against that, and that's sort of the approach I'm trying to model with this show. Let's just acknowledge that there are many facts we don't know about the matter, and explore these very rich texts that allow us to think perhaps differently and explore it with a different pattern of thinking than we're typically able to as human beings. Now, here's one thing we can do, and this will be the focus of the show going forward. We can have this thing, listener, that I like to call, and what's typically referred to, as conversations. I don't know if you've heard of them, I don't know if you've had them, but they're pretty cool things. It's one thing that all humans typically have done, And there are many different types. So you can have small talk, right? We can just exchange pleasantries and share a mutual bond of television, of film, of music, and that allows for us to feel connected while at the same time we're not sort of going over any emotional topics like politics or something where we might find out that we have some difference and we get disgusted by that. We can have just small, friendly banter, and that's a beautiful thing. That's a way to quickly make a bond with a stranger, and it's guaranteed to not be emotional or tribal because we're sticking to very loose ideas and loose topics and superficial little things. But if we wanted to, for instance, have a conversation about why are we here, what are we doing, and we have a close friend or family member that we think would be up for it, regardless of whatever, if it's a heated debate or whatever it is, the conversation itself is just the tool. It's just the tool that we're using to sort out the wheat from the chaff, as I think the Canadians say. We're trying to find out what do we actually know, what is just ignorance that's just manifesting. And we actually, it's sort of like I view it as a fencing match, or perhaps a better analogy for my nerds out there, a real-time strategy game. So like a StarCraft match or a Warcraft or Command and Conquer, whatever fits your fancy. You know when you're playing a strategy game with your friend and you know that like he has a bad time with like multitasking, and so you know that he's not going to be able to mine his resources at all his bases at the same time, and so for that reason you pick a strategy that's going to disrupt his mining and kill off his workers when he's not looking, and this just completely disorients him and you manage to cripple him, and you haven't held back in any respect. You've gone all out to beat him in this game. Just like with fencing, we try to use our are they swords? I don't know why I'm talking about a sport I've never watched or know nothing about. But they use their little needle swords and they poke each other, and they're really trying to hit each other. But the second you land a hit, you pull back. You're not trying to really hurt each other. And so in that respect, just like in the real-time strategy example, you really are trying to exploit your friend's weakness. But in that case, you're both playing the game with the mutual understanding that by doing this to each other, by jabbing and finding each other's weak spots and exposing them, we actually get mutually enriched. We get better at this skill, at this exercise, because now we're both more able to have a deeper understanding of how to react when we encounter this scenario in the future. And so that's what I'm saying for conversation. We should see conversation as a similar metaphor. And so arguments where they're just purely emotional or we're just trying to hurt each other with language, that doesn't really do much for me. I'm really trying to put forth the idea that we can have very coherent, logical conversations, not all logical because we're human beings, so emotion's going to come into it and we're going to have feelings hurt, but we can always come back to the understanding that what we're trying to do, whatever the topic is, we're trying to become mutually smarter. And even though we might challenge each other from time to time in a conversation that is about some of the most important topics, what do we think is going to happen after death, what do we think is the meaning of life right now, we have very strong opinions on this, but the thing we always want to guard against is the superficial layer of emotional reactivity that comes forth, just because we're being disagreed with, or just because someone is saying we might have missed something. That sort of egoic, I didn't miss anything. Are you kidding me? I'm the smartest person alive. That, whatever that is, and I'm sure that impulse is there for people. It's certainly there for me. I'll speak for myself. But So, and here's what I'll say. This is the last thing I'll say before we go to the next segment. I hope that's enough groundwork there, and I hope I've explained clearly how I see the matter, and how what I'm trying to do with this show is at least give people a way of seeing the issue in a non-judgmental way, sort of seeing multiple texts on the issue and developing a pluralistic view of it, because I don't really have strong opinions about this stuff myself. I just sort of when I read this stuff, it's sort of a transcendent meaning in and of itself, because you're being exposed to these ideas that people have had long before you. That's sort of an attachment to a transcendence right there. I think that is quite powerful once you go into the real ideas of these thinkers and how these philosophical insights tend to repeat themselves across time. I don't think enough is said for that. And what I'll just say to finish this segment is that in any conversation, your most powerful weapon is listening. It's allowing the other person to actually say what they want in a way that doesn't feel hostile, that doesn't feel like they're actually being attacked. And in this way, you can have whatever reaction you want to have, but the idea that you're going to cut the person off or not be sensitive to the fact that it's very difficult to form thoughts, especially on some of the most hardest questions of our feeble little minds can try to operate on. You have to approach these conversations with enormous charity, in my opinion, such that the idea that you would ever take a certain word that they said or a certain phrase and then sort of try to summarize their position in a way that's highly uncharitable just so you can sort of slam it down with your argument, this is totally unfair. And if we want to have good conversations about some of the most important issues in human life, such as politics and religion and death and meaning, then we need to come at it with enormous trust and enormous charity to the other person's point of view. And if we're unable to do that, then I don't know, maybe the situation's more hopeless than I think. But I think we can. I think we can do that. And Socrates is going to model an approach for us in the next segment that we'll look at in the Republic. Stay tuned.
Or like flame. Or like flame.
But in the sense. But in the sense. But in the sense. But in the sense.
Or like flame.
Well, why's that?
Or like flame.
Well, why's that?
But in the sense. But in the sense, perhaps I hope, of your listening to someone play a musical classic.
Welcome back to Socratic Smarts. There's a quote here on rationalization, I think, is by Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson in The Elephant in the Brain. They say, quote, "What these studies demonstrate is just how effortlessly the brain can rationalize its behavior. Rationalization, sometimes known to neuroscientists as confabulation, is the production of fabricated stories made up without any conscious intention to deceive. They're not lies, exactly, but neither are they the honest truth." And they go on to say that rationalization of this kind is an epistemic forgery, end quote. And so this is kind of capturing what I'm getting at. We really need the resource of how other conscious minds are viewing an issue, how other people around me thinking about this, and I need that honest interpretation as well, not just what you're going to say to the mob who's threatening you to say something or say an opinion, but what do you honestly think? Like, what is your honest opinion so that I can course correct? And so with that said, in the Republic, we're looking at, if you're playing along at home or if you're that interested in the excerpts we read today, that you're going to get into the text itself, which I think would be a great idea. We're looking at the Republic, and it's chapter 1, where we're looking at a excerpt between Thrasymachus and Socrates, and this is before the nitty-gritty political element begins, where Plato goes very deep into how he'd like to see the reforms in Athenian society. This is kind of at the start where the dialogue gets a soft kick-off, and we're just going to talk about what justice is. And we're kind of jumping into it at a point where Socrates has talked about what he doesn't think justice is, and this is upsetting a close person around who's overhearing the dialogue, and his name is Thrasymachus, and he is getting a little bit upset. The dialogue begins with a little bit of exposition. Quote, "While we had been talking, Thrasymachus had often tried to interrupt, but had been prevented by those sitting near him. He was no longer able to keep quiet, but gathered himself together and sprang on us like a wild beast, as if he wanted to tear us to pieces. Polemarchus and I were panic-stricken, as Thrasymachus burst out and said, "What is all this nonsense, Socrates? Why do you go on in this childish way, being so polite to each other's opinions? If you really want to know what justice is, stop asking questions, and then playing to the gallery by refuting anyone who answers you. You know perfectly well that it's easier to ask questions than it is to answer them. Give an answer yourself and tell us what you think justice is. And don't tell me that it's duty or expediency or advantage or profit or interest. I won't put up with nonsense of that sort. Give me a clear and precise definition." End quote. And so there we kind of underscore the context of who is hostile and who is on the defense here. So we kind of start off immediately with the idea that Thrasymachus is emotional. We could say that Plato doesn't portray this character in a very charming way in the dialogue. But what we kind of get here is the context that what do you do when someone is engaging ostensibly on the level of tell me what you think. I want to know what you think on any particular issue. What do you think of justice? What do you think of honor? What do you think of the meaning of life, right? It could even be that deep of a prod that someone is getting at, but clearly the underlying emotive approach is hostile. This is clearly the case in Thrasymachus. He's asking Socrates, give me an answer, tell me what you think, but obviously he's being highly uncharitable, and you get the sense that the second Socrates begins to give him an answer, he'll be falling into a kind of rhetorical trap, you might say, and Thrasymachus here could easily just misinterpret something that Socrates might say, and because keep in mind this is happening in public, this is a public discussion. We have other members of the dialogue like Glaucon and Adimantus, Plato's older brothers, and also there's just, you'd expect in the Athenian society there's people in the public witnessing this discussion. So in some sense they're really not just trying to sincerely engage one another. It's not like a Sam Harris podcast where they're sitting across from each other and they're really trying to understand each other's intentions. They're kind of having this discussion in public, and this kind of allows for a context where you can be more rhetorical and be more sanctimonious. And so let's go back into it, where we begin with Socrates responding to Thrasymachus' challenge to define justice. Socrates responds in his manner, quote, "Don't be hard on us, Thrasymachus. If we have made any mistake in our consideration of the argument, I assure you we have not done so on purpose. For if we were looking for gold, you can't suppose that we would willingly let mutual politeness hinder our search and prevent our finding it. Justice is much more valuable than gold, and you must not think that we shall slacken our efforts to find it out of any idiotic indifference to each other. I assure you, we are doing our best. It's the ability that we lack, and clever chaps like you ought to be sorry for us and not get annoyed with us." End quote. Thrasymachus laughs sarcastically to this because he thinks that Socrates is, again, basically trying to play the victim, trying to go full SJW on Thrasymachus. I don't know if SJW was a thing back then, but maybe it was. And he goes to Thrasymachus. Well, really how I see it is that he's saying to Thrasymachus, look, I don't know, man. So just, chill out. And this gets to the heart of what conversation allows us to do. It allows us to bridge a divide on a sensitive issue, but also just form a bond that goes beyond the merely explicit rules. We actually intrinsically both feel connection, and therefore that allows us to have the patience really to sit through moments of feeling offended or being upset. There's a deeper layer of trust that has to set in order to have that sort of linguistic boxing match. And so Socrates says to him, look, we can get into it, but we need to approach it with our obvious acknowledgement of our own idiocy. And so if you think you're so wise as to already have figured it out, Thrasymachus, please, the floor is yours. But at the same time, I will not suppose to be any smarter or any more of an intellectual than I consider myself, which is not really much of all. And, this really gets to the heart of it. I mean, what if you found out, listener, tomorrow your favorite family member or your closest friend was a Nazi? What if you just found that they'd been sucked down some, YouTube rabbit hole as it is supposed to have happened these days, and some social media algorithm has pulled them into some fake news vacuum. I mean, I'm sure it's happened. And I mean, well, how would you approach that? I mean, what I would like to think anyway, just as we might call it a thought experiment here, Uncle Larry the overnight Nazi, I would try to approach that with at least feeling that I would want the tools to be able to sit across from a table and say, hey, what happened? You know, you used to be this great guy, and now you're saying all these beliefs that I refined to be repugnant. Let's see if I can convince you, or let's see if I can first hear what got you there in the first place and really sincerely connect with the intention of what you're saying. And so that I'm not misunderstanding, I'm not just calling you some sort of name, but I'm really listening. And that, as I said in the first segment, is a kind of superpower, because then when you respond, you can, if they're listening, if they're reciprocating, and if you are able to form that actual conversation that whereby you have that mutual trust, and if it's a close family member, it might just be that they got confused about their idea of race theory, right? And then and a lot of superficial beliefs have sort of stemmed out of just a fundamental misunderstanding of biology. And so if you can talk with them and get to that fundamental layer, oh, you're just mistaken about that. And now the difference here obviously kicks in when someone is unwilling to listen to reason on every level. Of course, what reason do you give to the person who doesn't value being reasonable? What rational proposal or argument are you going to present to the person who is irrational? Let me just point out as well that Socrates, this is the tactic he uses to get the Thrasymachus's version of what he thinks justice is. This is the exact tactic he uses. He says, look, I don't know, but please, I will listen to you, and then we can begin this conversation. But I know that in order to get you to talk, I can't just start, calling you names or saying that you are somehow intrinsically not allowed to have your opinion. So Thrasymachus is pushing him to give an explanation. Socrates says to Thrasymachus, quote, "But, my dear man, what am I to do? I neither know nor profess to know anything about the subject, and even if I did, I have been forbidden to say what I think, by no mean antagonism. It's much more reasonable for you to say something because you say you know, and really have something to say. Do, please, therefore do me a favour and give me an answer, and don't grudge your instruction to Glaucon and the others here." End quote. So again, this is stressing a kind of similar point, but it's a more nuanced point, which is that certainty is really the enemy of having a clear, nuanced point of view. And so Socrates makes very clear that the person who should be first to speak is going to be the person who claims to be absolutely certain what justice is. I believe the late Christopher Hitchens had a line when he was debating a lot of religious folk that, before we begin any debate, it's the person who thinks he claims to be in contact with God who has to leave the room first.
That despite innumerable revivals, innumerable attempts again to preach the truth, innumerable attempts to convert the heathen, innumerable attempts to send missionaries all around the world, that the same problems remain with us, that nothing is resolved by this, that if all religions died out, or all were admitted to be false, instead of, as all believers will tell you, only some of them are false. In other words, we're faced with the preposterous proposition that religion are either all of them true, or none of them true, or only one exclusive preachment is true. And none of these seem to me coherent, and all of these seem to be the outcome of a man-made cult. Assume that all of them were discredited at the same time, all of our problems would be exactly what they are now. How do we live with one another? Where indeed do morals and ethics come from? What are our duties to one another? How shall we build the just city? How shall we practice love? How shall we deal with the baser, what Darwin called the lowly stamp of our original origins, which comes not from a pact with the devil or an original sin, but from our evolution as well.
Now, this is just to point out, I'm not making any religious point, or I'm not trying to offend any sensitivities on the matter. I'm just trying to point out that there is a kind of problem with certitude, that it prevents a further wisdom from evolving, and that namely is the recognition of one's limitations and ignorances. And that's all the point that Socrates is making now. If it is quite true that you have the answer here, Thrasymachus, simply tell us and simply let us know, and we'll all be wiser. But to claim that I must give an answer, I have not said I have any knowledge of the subject. We're simply having a discussion with the understanding that we're epistemically quite limited, and we're using each other as a resource to create a greater foundation for saying what we think might be true by critiquing each other and having that Socratic dialogue. And before we go to a break, just to stress this point, there's another excerpt we could look at here. Quote, this is Thrasymachus responding to Socrates now. So this is the wisdom of Socrates. He won't teach anything to anyone, but goes around learning from others and is not even grateful. To which I replied, it's quite true, Thrasymachus, to say I learn from others, but it's not true to say that I show no gratitude. I am generous with my praise, the only return I can give, as I have no money. You'll see in a moment how ready I am to praise a good answer, for I'm sure the one you're going to give me will be good. End quote. And that really demonstrates that point of kind of the virtue of seeking out your ignorance, kind of an honest ignorance, and that being a powerful thing to have. Okay, after the break, we'll be looking at more of the Republic. Stay tuned.
It is that you are looking right at the brilliant light now. That the experience you are having, which you call ordinary everyday consciousness, pretending you're not it, that experience is exactly the same thing as it. There's no difference at all. And when you find that out, you laugh yourself silly. That's the great discovery.
Welcome back to Socratic Smarts, my dear listener. Thank you for sticking it out this far in the show. That implies to me that you've enjoyed it so far. If you do want to contact the show with any questions or advice, or just you want to just get in contact, please do so at socraticsmarts@gmail.com. Also on Twitter at socraticsmarts. All social media should be Socratic Smarts. Check it out. I mean, probably not Facebook. I think Facebook's kind of done, isn't it? I mean, who's on Facebook these days, really? I mean, maybe we're on there, but like, who really checks it? Is that even a thing? So no, Facebook, I won't be on there, but Twitter, email, everywhere else, YouTube. Please, any way you want to contact the show, if you want to give some feedback, I would love to hear it. So please do that. So before we get into the final excerpt of the Republic I want to talk about, and we're going to be talking about how Socrates responds to Thrasymachus with his argument about justice, and why he thinks in the end that injustice never pays more than justice. Justice sort of has this intrinsic feature of being something that's worth doing. It sort of pays itself in that way. You don't need any reward for doing the just thing. It's sort of a feature of your mind that you would tend to do the just thing because it's just pleasurable for you in that sense. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Between recording these segments, I came across this Buddhist scripture, and it's called "A Murderer Becomes a Monk." And because of the theme of this show so far has broadly been about how do we have conversations about the most interesting but also challenging and treacherous topics, particularly in philosophy, like how do we tackle some of the most emotive and tribal topics that have been more or less privileged in certain groups for a millennia, right? We're finally able to tackle this territory in a different way with a more maybe rational, non-judgmental perspective. And then the other theme we were drawing throughout the episode is, given the power of conversation, given its scientific ability to explore questions in a way and explore our contradictions and and our ability to be coherent, given that it's a very rich tool for this exercise of discovering ignorance, should we have some ethical obligation to challenge others, especially people that we care about in our lives, when we think that they are mistaken or they're letting ignorance of something change their view, or have some ethical view towards other people that we deem to be sort of anachronistic or outdated or just sort of wrong? And so this scripture on a murderer becomes a monk sort of highlights this point, because the Buddha comes across this young man. His name is Angulimala, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but it translates to finger necklace. And the reason why it translates to that is because his name got given to him after he had killed 999 people and had created a necklace of their fingers, because this was a task given to him by one of his mentors in his youth as a sort of sick sort of joke. And he went along with it even though he didn't really want to, because of the duty that he thought he must do it. His teachers told him to go and get those fingers. And the Buddha knows this about him. He seeks him out and he says to him, quote, "Angulimala, I have stopped forever. I have abstained from violence towards living things, but you have no restraint towards things that live. That's why I have stopped and you have not." Angulimala responds, "Oh, at last, long this recluse, this venerated sage, has come to this great forest for my sake. Having heard your stanza teaching me the Dharma, I will indeed renounce evil forever." So saying, the bandit took his sword and weapons and flung them in a gaping chasm's pit. The bandit worshipped the sublime one's feet, and then there asked for the going forth. End quote. And essentially what you have happen there is the Buddha transforms this serial killer in a matter of one conversation. And I guess the general idea there is that anyone is just one conversation away from correcting their misapprehension of the world, and therefore living a more fulfilling life, a more examined life, whereby they're not mistakenly thinking of other human beings as beneath them or some sort of thing, where the Buddha is really able to make him realize that with, you might say, some magical power, right? This is a religious text after all, but the general theme, I think, that is important there, that definitely applies to this episode when we talked about the thought experiment of Uncle Larry, the overnight Nazi. We really have this tool, and it's really about your ability to put your own emotions aside. Like, maybe you have your own opinion about the fact that this guy is a serial killer who's killed 999 townspeople for no reason, right? But the general reaction to that is going to be fearful of him. And the Buddha, because of his, venerated magical ability to just be with whoever he's with, he's able to transform him in the midst of one conversation. So maybe that's a bit too idealistic that even a murderer could be transformed after one conversation, but it certainly gets to the heart of our kind of philosophical approach as individual human beings to see the world, and whether or not we're capable of forgiveness on that level is an interesting question in and of itself. But I thought I'd just bring that up, given that that's the kind of theme we've been looking at, and I think it applied pretty well. But let's go back to the Republic now, and we'll get into this final excerpt between Socrates and Thrasymachus, whereby Socrates is now explaining to Thrasymachus his version of the argument and how he sees justice. He says, quote, "We must now proceed to the further question which we set ourselves, whether the just live better and happier lives than the unjust. It is, in fact, already clear, I think, from what we have said, that they do. But we must look at the question more closely, for it is not a trivial one. It is our whole way of life that is at issue." "Proceed," he said. "I will," I replied. "So tell me, do you think a horse has a function?" "Yes." "And would you define the function of a horse or anything else as something one can only do or does best with the thing in question?" "I don't understand." "Look at it this way. Can you see anything but eyes? Again, can you hear anything but ears? Certainly not. So we can rightly call these the functions of the eye and ear." "Yes." "So again, could you cut off a vine shoot with a carving knife or a chisel or other tool? But you would do the job best if you had a pruning knife made for the purpose." "True." "Shall we call this its function?" "Yes, let us." End quote. So this excerpt underscores how Socrates will respond to this case that Thrasymachus has made, that injustice pays more than justice, because he's trying to point out that Socrates does not, he really thinks that the function of a human being requires that one is just. So justice is a way to find happiness in this life and find that function of what a human being is supposed to seek, simply because it is a good guide to having the right outcomes. So Thrasymachus wants to make the case that, well, you can maybe, steal from other people, and justice is simply whatever we determine to be, whatever is in the interest of the stronger. We can just decide what justice is. We can make it up as we go along. And Socrates really is pushing back against this, because he wants to find the essential feature of justice that makes it compelling to even those people who are in power and still do the right thing, still trying to seek out their own excellence in their own function as human beings and as conscious minds. So let's go back to Socrates' point here. He says, quote, "The next point is this. Is there any function that is impossible to perform with anything except the mind? For example, paying attention, controlling, deliberating, and so on. Can we attribute any of these to anything but the mind, of which we should say they were particular characteristics? And what about life? Is not that a function of the mind? Very much so. And the mind will surely have its peculiar excellence? It will. And if deprived of its particular excellence, will it perform its function well, or will it be incapable of doing so? Quite incapable. It follows, therefore, that a good mind will perform the functions of control and attention well, a bad mind badly. And we agree, did we not, that justice was the peculiar excellence of the mind, and injustice its defect. So the mind and the just man will have a good life, and the unjust a bad life. So it appears from your argument. But the man who has a good life and is prosperous and happy, and his opposite the reverse, so the just man is happy and the unjust man miserable? So be it. But it never pays to be miserable, but to be happy. And so, my dear Thrasymachus, injustice never pays better than justice. This is your holiday treat, Socrates, so enjoy it. If I do enjoy it, it's thanks to you, Thrasymachus, I replied. End quote. In that last segment there, we kind of get another glimpse of Socrates as the sarcastic sort of, thanks, I'm right in the end anyway, but thanks for the journey, Thrasymachus. But I kind of see that as almost sincere. I mean, there is something to be said about the fact that I don't know what I think until you tell me what you think, or you even are able to process what I am saying. Because when we think about what are words intrinsically anyway, this is an interesting discussion in the philosophy of language and in linguistics in general. What are words except just a way of sort of teleporting ideas across human minds, right? So if I have a particular argument for something, you might hear a certain word in a different way, and that sort of skews your understanding of it. But if we're able to always come back and say, oh, okay, now here's what I think, here's what you think, let's get a little bit clearer. Let me try restate your argument in a way that you would agree with, and you do the same for me, and then we can at least come at it with a better understanding. If there is a core disagreement, that we at least understand the other person's position, and we're not just sort of misrepresenting it in our own minds so that it's easier to argue against and it's easier to rationalize to ourselves. And Socrates seems to be distinctly aware of this. And again, just to draw it back to where we began this episode, this is definitely, in my opinion, a core aspect of the Socratic dialogues, where as a participant in this conversation, you are really able to ask the questions yourself. That's why I think Plato chose to do a dialogue format as opposed to some narrative third-person story, because you're really in the midst of an argument and there is no certain answer at the end. I mean, you might gravitate towards Socrates' reasoning because simply he's the protagonist and he's sort of at least Plato's voice in the dialogue, but I don't think it's really necessary to take everything he says as some sort of dogma. And this is the interesting and compelling aspect of the ancient Greek philosophy that I think you won't get in other traditions because of the component of magic or mysticism, because we don't have to believe that Socrates even existed. There's very good evidence to suppose that he existed, but even if he didn't, it wouldn't really mean much, would it? Because what matters about Socrates is his method, is his fortitude in standing up to people who simply want to punish him for asking questions and challenging people. And it's this attitude, it's this philosophy, it's this approach to life where we constantly examine and realize that the birth of education and intelligence begins when discovering ignorance, and that is the foundation that we need to start from if we hope to have anything aspiring to real knowledge. It's these ideas that have been so transformative and powerful in many people, and it continues to, I think, generate discussion today. I mean, you can't go into a philosophy classroom without bringing up Socrates and this approach to the dialectical aspect of philosophy. I think that's such a core feature that's often missed by people, because maybe they think that it's just about sort of everyone talking and no one ever coming up with a good conclusion, or it's just sort of academics in their ivory tower playing ping pong all day. But the truth is, we can always come in our everyday lives have these conversations where we say, let's try to get deep on this issue, and there doesn't need to be this sort of, you might say, this sort of tiptoeing around each other's feelings all the time. We can sort of acknowledge that we're human beings and that feelings are going to be involved. When Thrasymachus is lashing out, Socrates doesn't just run away or just say, oh, you've infringed on my safe space and now we can't have a conversation. He says, okay, well, look, you're a bit steamed up. Let's get clear on the issue. And he takes him through an argument in that way we just outlined, in a very systematic way where he's isolating all of the different variables that Thrasymachus is trying to sort of mash together in his argument. And he says, let's break it down, let's have an understanding, and maybe we can come to some coherence and some sort of actual common understanding in the end, as opposed to just walking away and we're both upset and sort of angry. But anyway, okay, that's been the kind of theme of this episode. Conversations, aren't they amazing? Aren't they such a good thing? Understanding as human beings, as a common species. If we're unable to do that, unfortunately, there's not other options available beyond just tribal violence and sort of resorting back to our evolutionary environments where that was the norm, and conversation was not the way we bridged the divide across tribes. And we want to not lose that moral upgrade, you might say, that we've managed to embed in our societies through the clauses that relate to free speech and free expression, and completely openly challenging the government and people in power. That is such an essential feature of our society that we ought not to lose it, and we ought not to forget the value of challenging people even when they claim to be offended. They might be offended, but even when they claim to be offended and they're not really offended, just as a tool to sort of gain social currency, we really need to, as a sort of system of human beings, evaluate whether that is an appropriate response to being challenged, particularly if it's an actual sincere challenge to one's morality that they've infringed in some way, that they actually need to be challenged. But I think that'll do it for today, dear listener. Thank you for coming back to Socratic Smarts. Hope to see you again in the future. Again, if you want to contact the show, socraticsmarts@gmail.com. And that's it. We'll see you next time.
Here is the point. Here is the point. Here is the point.
Chop the volume and go down on the other side. Pick up the different. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. Did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight, whether this is quite authentic.